everybody. I'm Ben. I'm going to be the chair of this panel and also introduce our speakers. And after they go, they're going to just field their own questions. That's probably the most efficient way to do it. But I think Pippa's going to go first, and then Scott. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce both of them now, and then they can come up. Pippa Holloway is the Cornerstone's chair in the history of the University of Richmond. She received her BA from UNC Chapel Hill, and her master's from UNC Greensboro, and her PhD from The Ohio State University. Professor Holloway's research focuses on legal and political culture in the South. She's the author of Living in Infamy, fellow in disenfranchisement in the history of American citizenship, which was published by Oxford in 2013, which was funded in part by the Soros Justice Fellowship from the Open Society Foundation. She's also the author of Sexuality, Politics, and Social Control in Virginia, 1920 to 1945, which I have many times successfully taught in my classes, which was published by UNC in 2006, which won the Lilly Rose Prize from the Southern Association for Women's Historian. Her current research examines 19th century women's issues and the ability to testify in court. She presently serves on the Committee on College and University Governments for the AAUP, and is also the president of the University of Richmond chapter of the AAUP. Scott Huffard lives in Beach Mountain, North Carolina, and is an associate professor of history at McRae College. He received his PhD from the University of Florida in 2013, and his first book, Engines of Redemption, Railroads and the Reconstruction of Capitalism in the New South, was published by UNC Press in 2019. He's currently researching and writing a second book project on the life and legend of engineer and folk hero Casey Jones. So, Pippa, Scott.
Thanks for the intro, and I'm awfully glad to be here and to see all of you, especially Bill in the audience. I'm going to talk today about a current research project of mine and use this as an opportunity at various points to talk about Bill's work and its influence on me and others. I'm going to be talking today about Virginia Penny, who some of you may know was women's labor activist, women's labor advocate in the 19th century. She was born in Meade County, Kentucky in 1826 and died in Brooklyn, New York in 1913. She was educated at Steubenville Female Cemetery, which, if you know your geography real well, will realize is down the Ohio River from Meade County, Kentucky. She was very much a Ohio River person in a lot of ways. And in 1863, she wrote the book that made her most famous, How Women Can Make Money, Married or Single, in all the branches of the arts, sciences, professions, trades, agricultural, mechanical pursuits. Which made a pretty big splash at the time. It was kind of a compendium of the jobs that women held in the 19th century and remains relevant in various ways. Nancy Hewitt told me earlier that it was on her reading list for her PhD exam a few years ago. So for people that know the field of women's history, they're probably at least vaguely familiar with Virginia Penny's name. She kind of drops out of the historical record for most people at that point, largely because in the 1870s and 1880s, she becomes very involved in her brother's life. One of her brothers, Henry, was institutionalized in a mental asylum, first in the Western Lunatic Asylum in Kentucky, and then after it burned down, in the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in Philadelphia. And over the course of his many years in these institutions, she became increasingly concerned with the quality of care he was getting, quite reasonably so, as well as the expense, the way that the family was being billed for his care, and so on. All this kind of culminated in 1882 in an incident summarized in this newspaper article. I'll read it to you quickly. A crazy woman on a rampage. Louisville, on Sunday afternoon, Miss Virginia C. Penny, an authoress, called to the office of Colonel Thomas W. Bullitt, a prominent attorney, and attempted to shoot him. He escaped, and she visited the office of Charles Erman, where she found Mr. Abner Smith, the law partner of Colonel Bullitt. She presented a pistol at his head, but it was quickly wrenched from her hand. She was arrested, and an examination proved that she was violently insane. She had a brother, H.C. Penny, in the insane asylum on whose behalf Colonel Bullitt and Mr. Smith had been acting. Now, probably at this point, many of you are thinking, well, she was crazy. She was demented, she had something going on, there was something not right about Virginia Penny. And in fact, whenever I talk to people about this project, that's always their reaction when I get to this punchline of the gun in the courthouse. But I want to push ourselves for a minute here or throughout my talk to sort of about this reflex that she must have been crazy. And that's sort of the beginning of the roadmap of what I want to talk about today. I want to first talk about reactions to Virginia Penny, how her aberrant behavior became labeled insanity at various points in her life. But I also want to talk about her reactions to those who scrutinized and ridiculed her, because in some ways it seems that these reactions provoked her even more. She was certainly not a passive object of scrutiny, although she was a frequent object of scrutiny. And all this adds up to what, I guess a couple of things. First of all, what Virginia Penny called a state of desperation. When she went into the office with the gun and was asked about it later, she said, "I was in a state of desperation," which I take to sort of be that moment that your anger bleeds into like an irrational rage. And I'll admit that I started this project and wrote most of this paper during the Trump presidency and the COVID epidemic. Times, I think, in which that sort of intersection of anger and insanity came into our minds in a number of ways. For some of us, like, oh my God, this is making me crazy. This world around me, I am so mad that I'm possibly becoming irrational. But then also the flip side of, I'm thinking, for example, of the State of the Union address the other night in the crowd and thinking, are these people crazy? Like, what is wrong with these people? And like this, is it genuine insanity? Is it performative insanity? What's going on here? So Virginia Penny is a little bit of a way to think about these questions. And then finally, and of course there's also this question of how her anger fueled her activism and limited her political activism. And finally, how all this relates to the man of the hour. How all this relates to the man of the hour, Bill Link, his life and scholarship. So Virginia Penny's life after the publication of her book kind of takes its first moment here during the Civil War. And during the Civil War, she's 35 years old, and she's living in Meade County, Kentucky. She was from a fairly rich, white, slave-owning family, and I think she decamped to Meade County to kind of wait out the war. Although pretty soon, actually, before we get to that, she waited out the Civil War in Meade County, Kentucky, which of course makes me think about our friend Roger Pryor, which actually, if you think of their birth dates, they're very, very similar generationally, and also in some level geographically. Penny was more of an Ohio River border South person, Pryor obviously in Virginia for the war, although interestingly, but they both wind up in Brooklyn and die at almost exactly the same time, or within a couple years of each other at least, in Brooklyn, New York. So they both also take this path from the South into New York. Penny, as we'll see, was obsessed with both journalism and the law. One has to think they would have gotten along rather well, actually, in various ways. Anyway, during the Civil War, Virginia Penny becomes into the sights of a Civil War informant who went by the name of Edward Hoffman. He wrote about her actually a good bit in his correspondence back to New York. You probably can't see most of this, but he describes her. He's convinced that she's spying for the Confederacy, possibly smuggling arms back and forth across the Ohio River. He says you'd better have her intercepted at some point below here. She may leave the river at Louisville. She's one of those deep, dark women who can be confidential without leading you into her profound secrets. She is very adroit and professes great piety. He wrote about her again later. I've not had time to develop Miss Penny. She's too old to be impulsive and has too clear a head to confide when there is no object to be gained. She is to leave here tomorrow. I'm well convinced she is here carrying off weapons, etc., etc. Anyway, so this is one of the first of many instances in which somebody notices her, finds her unusual, finds her a little bit baffling, and thinks of her as being also a little bit dangerous. In 1865, right after the war, she gets hired as a teacher in Louisville, Kentucky. And after teaching there for less than a year, she gets brought up on charges of assaulting a student. I gotta read you a couple of the quotes here. There's a brief trial in which she's put on she actually has like a disciplinary hearing, which she then insists to actually be heard in a regular court of law. It becomes actually a civil suit in which the family of the child sues her for damages to their child. And then after all this, I haven't actually found court records of these suits, but afterwards she writes a long public letter to the Louisville Democrat defending her behavior, which is interestingly published on Christmas Day. And she points out in the letter, for example, that many of the witnesses against her were unreliable because they were children, and she says they were glaringly ignorant. She admitted to whipping the boy with a small leather strap, but she did not think that any of these punishments were particularly cruel, because when his alarmed parents took him to the doctor, there was no medical attention. He didn't actually require medical attention. She also admitted to securing the help of a school janitor who held the boy down while she poured water on his face. The child was 6 years old, by the way. But she said the water was not more than a half-gallon quantity and appeared to have a cool and soothing effect. And moreover, all this was deserved because the boy had committed acts of insubordination, resistance, indecency, and vulgarity. She just went on and on in her letter. She critiqued the schools, the principal, the other teachers. She said that the disciplinary process was probably tinged with gender bias. She exclaimed, "Was it because I was a lady and not a man?" She attacked the family's attorney, pointing out that as a child he had been expelled from school 26 times. She suggested that city leaders had targeted her because she had exposed Louisville's paucity of artistic and charitable institutions, on and on and on. Her response might have struck many as somewhat paranoid. She claimed there was a vast conspiracy against her. It was certainly an over-the-top reaction. She was found guilty by the court, but fined only 1 cent as a sort of symbolic punishment. And this is one of many points in which one suspects that those observing her must have thought she was completely insane. Which brings us to A Hard Country and a Lonely Place. I sort of conceived of this talk as sort of a footnote of my footnotes. Like if I was writing this, or when I'm writing this, and wrote this incident about the school, and if you looked into the footnotes of the books that I was citing, I was thinking that Bill's work would show up in a lot of those places, in terms of, for example, thinking about a career as a teacher in the South. This is slightly before his time period in this book, and although his book is primarily about rural schools, there are points of comparison to urban schools, the experiences of teachers, the relationship between state and local authority. So this is one of many spots where Bill's work would definitely inform the historical context in which I was writing. Now it's the 1870s. In the 1870s, Virginia Penny winds up in the public eye again because she levied a series of attacks on suffrage activists. In fact, she did a couple of interviews and wrote an article in which she derided women's suffrage activists by lobbying a variety of specific accusations against Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Mary Livermore, Mary Bradwell, Parker Pillsbury. She claimed that the leaders of the Equal Rights Association had fabricated her involvement in the group. Presumably, she seemed to suggest to boost the group's credibility. If one was diagnosing her at this point, you might say this was an example of, say, delusions of grandeur. She definitely has an eye for unlikely, arguably paranoid conspiracies. And throughout it all, she likes publicity, which makes her really great to research because she just keeps showing up in the newspaper record and the historical record in all these kind of unlikely places. Which brings us to the 1870s and 1880s, when she really drills down into her brother's experiences. Now, her family was pretty complicated. She was one of six children, 3 of whom seem to have had some serious mental problems. Henry, okay, actually, let's go back to the census for just a second here. Her brother, just 4 other children. Her brother Henry is the one we're going to focus on here. Her brother Acilius had long been in the care of family members. It's not clear to me what was going on with Acilius, but he had some kind of mental incompetency. Her brother Alexander is going to kill himself shortly. And finally, her brother William is the only one that didn't really have any overt tinge of mental problems. But Henry the oldest is the one that was institutionalized first in Kentucky, then Philadelphia. For her other 2 brothers, Alex and William, helped pay for his care, but much of it came from a trust in his name, much of the financing of his care. Virginia became concerned that the Philadelphia asylum was overcharging him for his care and neglecting him. After some work, largely by her, she manages to get him transferred back to a Kentucky asylum. So he's for about 12 years, he was in Philadelphia. Then he comes back to Kentucky to what's now Central State Hospital. Then, yeah, as I said earlier, all this is unfolding as she becomes increasingly concerned about her other brother, Acilius. He's the one who'd been unable to care for himself due to some kind of mental illness or disability. He lived with family members in Illinois, and she discovers in 1874 that he was being badly neglected and nearly starved to death. She travels out to Illinois to check in on him, screams at the family and tells them to get better care of them, then comes back to Louisville to keep focusing on Henry. So she's really being pulled in a lot of directions, or allowing herself to be pulled in a lot of directions here. Then in 1876, Alex, the youngest, killed himself. He'd been a Civil War veteran. It's not really clear what happened. Although when he killed himself, he says that part of the reason he killed himself was that he'd been disappointing his family, but also that he had committed immoral acts. So I don't quite know what was going on with him, but another sort of incident in her family. So this leaves her and her remaining brother William as the two that are left caring for Henry and his finances. This all starts getting really complicated, probably largely because of Virginia's interventions. The Pennsylvania hospital sued Henry's estate for unpaid bills. He's actually in Kentucky now. And then, because they'd refused to keep paying, they'd refused to settle up when he was transferred out of Philadelphia. Then a year later, the asylum he was in Kentucky also sues his estate for unpaid bills. And the problem for Virginia Penny is that she wasn't his legal guardian and had no authority over his care, his finances, or anything. I mean, she technically had absolutely no influence over what was going on with her brother. And she undertakes a several-year-long crusade to protect his finances and ensure the quality of his care. And these are the records I found at the Kentucky State Archives, where I went to dig into this right as COVID was unfolding in March of 2020. I went up there and scanned everything I could. It was one of those awesome stories in which you're in an archive and you find a gigantic file of someone's letters like this, and it was actually filed in the wrong box, so I had to do that thing where I had to ask for all the boxes around where it should be, and then I found it. And there's this kind of, I started to say insane, but this like spectacular collection of all of her notes and receipts that had somehow gotten bundled and stuck in with her brother's competency hearing files and his other civil. They basically put everything about Henry Penny in one case. And after going through all of the case files that were tagged with him, I found this pile. And in it are endless copies in her handwriting of all of the letters in which she goes in like spectacular levels of detail. She's writing to the Philadelphia asylum, she's writing to the Kentucky asylum, she's demanding that all of these payments were added up wrong. She actually goes all the way back to his initial committal in 1861 and the cash they handed over in 1861, and then calculates an annual payment. How she says they overcharged him for his undershirts. It's just like an incredible level of detail. She's going into over 20, like almost 20 years at this point of 15 years of his financial records in the asylum. There's spreadsheets, there's letters, it's literally like this thick. You can see here more, she has all these, I don't quite understand her whole accounting theories. There's hash marks and spreadsheets and all of these things. She also, in her letters, begins to spin conspiracy theories about the dastardly lawyers involved. She says, I attribute the murder or suicide, whatever it was, of my brother Alex, partly to Bullitt's behavior and his failing several times to pay the bills promptly. There had never been any suggestion that Alex was murdered. She's completely, as far as I can tell, making this up. So this is another conspiracy she's suddenly now spinning out. Which made me think again about Mr. Pryor, a book my dog also enjoyed. Although I think she looks a little alarmed in that photo. I was actually thinking, this is actually the last photo I added to this, but I was thinking about Virginia's anger and growing fury at the various men involved here. I was thinking if only she could have fought a duel. it really would have been helpful. And of course, Pryor was known for his love of duels, at least in theory, if not in practice. And I was thinking, of course, about the gender dimension of this. And of course, she couldn't have fought a duel as a woman, but she had some scores she really wanted to settle, and finally does it when she shows up with a pistol in the court. She also really is harassing the attorneys at this point. I called 4 times to see him. She kept going. Whenever she went to their offices, they always told her that she was out, that they were out. And they would always come up with stories as to where they were. And she became increasingly furious that these guys weren't doing their jobs. So she's like, one time, I went to his office 4 times, and twice he was at the fair. When I inquired about the status of the case, he complained like a sick kitten that his wife or child or father were sick. I cannot recall whether his sisters and his cousins and his aunts came in the same category or not. That's actually a rare moment of Virginia Penny humor in which she's referencing a Gilbert and Sullivan play. She said that one attorney had made a childish defense of her brother's assets, if a defense it be called. She referred to another attorney as a man or boy, so she's hurling insults at these men. She's also working tirelessly. Many frequenters of the courthouse who come in would see a frail little old lady who, attired in an indescribable quaint dress, old-fashioned material, copying every day for months in the courthouse. From under a black quilted bonnet edged with fur looks out a pale, wrinkled face, a pair of deep sunken eyes that shone with a forbidding light. The wrinkle-bound mouth was drawn in determined lines of a strongly marked character. So she's catching a good deal of attention while she's there. I'm actually going to grab my water real quick. Excuse me. Chipotle lunch was So in 1882, the court hands down a judgment in this lawsuit between the hospital and his estate. They say that the estate has to pay the hospital $232.73, which is actually a downward adjustment from the original bill of $331.25, all of which Virginia Penny had accounted for in multiple ways in all of her long investigations into this. She is furious. She thinks he doesn't owe any money at all, and that this is still a case of overbilling, but she has got nothing to do. I mean, she's got no power in this situation. Her legal options are exhausted. She pays a visit to both the mayor of Louisville as well as the governor to complain, asking them to intervene in the fact that her brother is being robbed, as she puts it. She visited the asylum director 5 times. She wrote to the chief of police of Louisville, telling them that her brother was being plundered by unprincipled lawyers of the little means he has left. And then she writes in the letter, if I could believe there was a God, I would say that his avenging hand was in it. Oh, so I should have been clearer here. A couple of the lawyers in the case had apparently been on a boat a couple of weeks earlier, and the boat had capsized and they'd nearly drowned. And she says in her letter, I wish they'd drowned. If they'd drowned, I'd have believed that it was the avenging hand of God in this. Then she visits the chief of police and asks permission to carry a gun, which he sort of grants her. He can't really not grant it to her, and that's the gun she then brings into the courtroom a couple days later. Mr. Bullitt, if you lay your hands on 1 cent of my brother's money, I intend to kill you. She is arrested. There is a competency hearing in which the attorneys testify as to her derangement and mental incapacity. She is put in the Central Kentucky Lunatic Asylum, the same place that her brother was also being held at that time. I pulled the record of her institutionalization. It says her unsoundness of mind occurred 8 or 10 years ago, was caused by, not known, a brother now in a lunatic asylum and one committed suicide. So, as was the case, the fact of having a family member sort of made it likely that you too, in the eyes of these folks, were also insane. There's a picture of the asylum where she was held in Anchorage, Kentucky. So while she's in the asylum, she gathered data on the inmates there. I went and wrote down the names of every patient in the ward, for I said to myself, here I am, and what can I do to give relief to these unhappy women? So I went around and talked with the patients and put down their names, about how long they were here, where they were from, and what, as far as I knew, was the cause of their illness. These were supposed to come up sequentially. Sorry, that was a little glitch. I was supposed to now reveal the book titles that were up here, and say that as I was reading about Virginia Penny, who basically while she's institutionalized, undertakes research on her fellow patients and begins to collect data and survey them and write down what was going on with them. And it made me think about later on, the world of Southern social science research pioneered at UNC under Howard Odom and with the assistance to some extent of Frank Porter Graham. And then as I was rereading Links the other week, I realized that Bill's mom, I guess, was also at UNC studying with Odom and also part of this world of social science research, which was much later, but this impulse that those two moments represent are this idea that, you know, one can better the world with study and research, and in a way Virginia Penny was a little bit of a part of that tradition as well, much earlier. But this idea that, you know, when you're somewhere that needs changing, start gathering data and see what you can do with it later. She actually gets out in a really interesting way. They didn't allow her to have any visitor, or they didn't allow her to have any writing materials. Once they figured out she was taking notes, they took away her writing materials, but she managed to smuggle a piece of paper and a pencil in her stockings. And one of her friends came to visit her, and she wrote down for her friend how to file a habeas corpus petition. And then her friend, Mary Wolfe, went back into Louisville, followed Virginia's instructions, and filed a habeas corpus petition on her behalf. The judge chose to hear it, which he didn't have to do, and they had a second insanity hearing now about 3 months after her institutionalization. And at this hearing, actually, the superintendent of the asylum spoke in defense of his institutionalization of her. And this is kind of an amazing quote. So he's arguing why she's insane. And he says, well, in various ways, the ideas she has, the theories she has of deportment, her peculiar notion of her rights, her interference in the matters belonging to other people. Miss Penny had some correspondence with me before she came to the asylum in reference to her brother. Her denunciation of men whose standing is as good as any in the community, her persistent efforts to outlaw everybody, her attempts to form societies, and the abuse she heaps on the most reputable men in the city. So in a sense, you know, she was speaking out. She was challenging the norm. She was challenging people with power. And this, for Robert Gale, was evidence of her insanity. Which indeed she was. She was behaving aberrantly for a woman of her time. She actually presents witnesses on her own behalf who testify that she was unusual, but not, in their opinion, insane. So there's this long discussion about her, and she wins, essentially. She's released from the asylum. In this case, it's a jury trial. The jury rejected the medical authority. They rejected Gale's testimony in favor of the testimony of her friends that she was not insane. She spoke extensively at her hearing. And then, in the aftermath of her institutionalization, she now turns her focus to asylum abuse and becomes a crusader of sorts against the institutions in Kentucky, saying that patients there are being abused, they're being mistreated. She chronicles the fairly horrifying violence perpetrated against patients there. There's a trial, actually, of one of the attendants there is actually put on trial for murdering a patient. There's a report. There's an investigation done into the asylums. And all of this, of course, made me think of Southern progressivism, this is, of course, a precursor of, but its goals are not, her goals here, of course, echo in all kinds of ways those of the progressive crusaders that were just at that point coming on the scene. She sought to advance humanitarian goals through a modernized mental health system, new administrative order, improved state interventions. And there was a resistance to reform and the persistence of localism in the defense of the doctors and the asylum staff. After 1885, Penny has a fairly ambiguous portfolio. She continues to show up in the news. She got into a fight with a man on a train on the way to St. Louis. He moved her bag. She went ballistic, called the conductor, threatened to have the man arrested, the conductor fired, and then wrote a long letter to the newspaper chronicling what happened. Which made me think of Jesse Owens. To the extent that Virginia Penny is unswerving and uncompromising, I believe those are some of Bill's words in the book, I can't remember exactly. She definitely had a sense of righteous propriety, and like Helms, understood the power of the press. She was always writing public letters and announcing things to the press. In 1887, she was living in Chicago. She got into a fight there with two young women in the flat she rented. She said they had been rude to her and too noisy, So she managed to try to get them charged with disorderly conduct. This all went to court, shows up in the news again. All of her travels made me think about her Southern identity. I actually plotted on a map all the places she lived, and you can see that a number of those locations are on the Ohio River, and then of course she goes north. And that made me think of the persistence of Southern identity in the Links family, even when not living in the South. And Bill talks about how North Carolina was so often home, even when North Carolina hadn't been home for quite some time. And it made me think about Virginia Penny and how the South seemed to be her home, even when she wasn't, or certainly the Ohio River Valley was her home, even when she kept sort of going away and then coming back to it. All of this ended rather badly for Virginia Penny. By 1900, she's in New York, living in various rented flats. There's a campaign to get people to donate money to her. A number of women's suffrage activists ask for donations to help her. She's in an almshouse. She's then in some kind of mental hospital or some sort of public hospital. Through all this, she remains just incredibly angry. She writes several letters actually critiquing those who were trying to help her, saying that they're not really helping her, they're actually denigrating her memory, that their accounts of her work are incorrect, that she had saved thousands of women from prostitution through advocacy of women's labor, so on and so forth. She actually eventually dies in a psychiatric hospital in 1913 or whatever I said it was. Finally, back to the Links and the body of work that is Bill Link. As I was writing this, I went back and read a number, or at least skimmed a few of these, but read a number of them again. And I wanted to just sort of think through also the extent to which Bill's written about subjects that also made me the academic and scholar that I am, and of course, through his involvement, making me the academic and scholar that I am, such as I am, maybe I should say. I met Bill when I was a master's student at UNC Greensboro, of course, part of the UNC system, which Frank Porter Graham and Bill Friday had a large impact on, and the spirit of free inquiry, as well as academic excellence at these two institutions were one of the reasons I was able to thrive there, along with the amazing faculty, such as Bill, and of course Stephen, who was also there at the time. I put on here the WC logo, which is what UNC Greensboro was called at that time. And then I also read the Helms book, and I was an undergraduate at UNC during the Helms years, and I was also a LGBT activist of sorts at UNC at the time that Jesse Helms was focusing much of his ire on LGBT people at UNC, and was actually president of the campus gay group for a minute, where, for example, we held a kiss-in to protest Helms's views. So it just made me think about all the ways that these different topics have sort of shaped who I am and how Bill's writing has, it was a sort of weird trip down memory lane, actually, to read about the Helms years in the 1980s and think of what I was able to see firsthand as from a front row seat in some ways. And then, of course, I have the primary source. I have the deposition in William Link versus Jacob Oliva. And this is, of course, the academic freedom that Bill's most recently put his time and energy and scholarly reputation on the line for in defending academic freedom and free inquiry at public universities. And all that also is part of what makes the real privilege of being able to talk about his influence on me, his influence on scholarship, and his continuing influence on American higher education today. So thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to fill in here, a little pinch hitting here for someone, but coming to a good time. I've been writing a lot this past semester or two for this new book project. It's a good chance to kind of share some of the stuff I'm working on and throw some ideas out there. Before I do that, I do want to briefly talk about sort of Bill Link a bit, of course, and his influence on sort of my work and my time at Florida here. I do have to give Bill some credit for pulling me towards Southern history in the first place. I grew up in Pennsylvania, went to Penn State, and I came here hoping to study coal miner strikes in Pennsylvania. That was my initial topic, I think, on my application. I think my second semester, I wrote a paper about yellow fever in Florida. Bill said, hey, you should really read C. Van Woodward and Adair's Origins of the New South and Promise of the New South, and I was hooked. The New South was just fascinating to me. It became sort of this excellent place to test a lot of these ideas I was interested in about capitalism, how Southerners are interacting with it, and the unique encounter the region has with capitalism. So now I'm in North Carolina teaching Southern history and listening to too many 1920s hillbilly records too. I guess that's where this project kind of comes out of, some of that, I guess. I also did really appreciate just the sense of community we all had in Gainesville. It's been sort of a trip down memory lane, just interacting with these spaces again here and seeing folks and reminiscing about some of the great times we had. I was here from 2007 to 2013. It was just a great environment. We had lots of Southern history grad students. I was thinking about all the bike rides we did, the post-seminar beers at the various bars, some of which are still here, some are not. Lots of change in that. The racquetball games, going to concerts in Gainesville, thinking about piling into cars for road trips to the SHA, which Bill always was a huge supporter of us going to the SHA and having these very elaborate receptions we had for a brief time there as well, which was a lot of fun. And those were just sort of great for building up a sense of community, a sense of camaraderie. Thinking about the Milbauer seminars as well, which were just excellent, and the research seminars, which sometimes got pretty combative sometimes and competitive, but that sort of fueled everyone's work and made us all better scholars. So it was just sort of great to be here, and his influence on the program really helped pull me into Southern history and has a huge impact on my work here as well. The paper I'm going to talk about today is stuff from my book on Casey Jones I'm working about and thinking about train wreck ballads in particular, and this really kind of morbid piece of Southern history, because they are Southern songs is kind of the point I want to make here. This paper is going to kind of reinforce some of the things we've been talking about how the South is a different region. It's important. It's a different region. It's distinctive. It has a distinctive encounter with capitalism and industrialization. And that's really what shaped my work, that kind of idea of how the South industrializes and goes to this unique encounter with these things. So yeah, I'm honored to be here, and without further ado, let me go into my paper here. So whether it be Casey Jones driving that train high on cocaine, old 97 going down the grade making 90 miles an hour, or engineer George Alley on the FFE murdered upon a railroad and laid in a lonesome grave, songs about train wrecks haunt American music. These songs almost always have a similar plot. We have a brave engineer, he's trying to make a run, he's running late, they have to speed up, a danger approaches, the train crashes, the engineer usually goes down with the train and dies in some grisly fashion, scalded to death by the steam, as in the case of old 97's Steve Brady. Doomed engineer Casey Jones, the main topic of my current book project, has enjoyed, of course, a very lengthy posthumous career as, at one point the most popular song of the 1910s, a very key part of the early country music repertoire, which I'll talk about, an IWW labor parody, and of course a much beloved Grateful Dead song, which today remains one of the band's most well-known. Vernon Dahlhart's 1924 recording, Record 187, has a really kind of important history in country music. The first country music record to go gold, actually. And just an odd song. I played this song to students. They're always sort of thrown off because it's very cheery sounding, but incredibly morbid. So yeah, interesting sort of songs here. There's been lots of writing on train wreck ballads from a folklorist perspective. Scholars have looked to track down different versions of these songs and variants and trace their evolution. I want to look at them from the perspective of a Southern historian today, though, and argue these are distinctively Southern stories. They're narratives of the New South that give us insight into the region's often ambivalent relationship with modernity, and their enduring presence in Southern music and folkways gives us insight into how the region's rapid industrialization has been interpreted and remembered by Southern workers. So I'm going to talk about ballad origins, where these songs come from, how they're collected, and then to the widespread proliferation of these songs in the 1920s during the hillbilly record boom that cemented them as country music standards. That's what I'll sort of cover here. On the most basic level, the southernness of these narratives can be seen by looking at where the songs are set. An author who chronicled 44 train wreck ballads found that 32 occurred in southern states. The Appalachian South was very fruitful terrain for train wreck ballads. Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky are the three most popular states where these songs come from. This is, on the most basic level, a function of the region's exceptionally dangerous railroads. In my first book, I wrote about this boom in construction after the Civil War, which connects the region, but also leads to all kinds of issues. There are lines built cheaply, there's corners cut, very poor records of maintenance. These problems get worse by the 1890s. Traffic demands ramp up on these railroads. We have financial difficulty hitting the southern rail lines with the financial crisis of the 1890s as well. So the numbers bear this out too. Over the course of this decade, the South has the most dangerous railroads in the nation on a per capita basis. So a much more intimate experience with railroad disaster. Ballad scholar Norm Cohen has argued that the initial origins of the train wreck ballad come from a feeling among railroad employees that the public was largely indifferent to the dangers of their work. It's a very dangerous job, of course. And as deaths and injuries mount on the railroad lines, this carnage of the day-to-day carnage of railroading inspires railroaders to write verses and songs to memorialize the fallen. That's where these songs mostly come from. The best hint that these came from individual railroad men, I think, comes to the fact that most of these songs are about pretty small wrecks. There are plenty of pretty big wrecks that killed lots of passengers, but the ones that become sort of famous, like the Casey Jones one, Old 97, kill just the engineer or a small handful of workers. We think that a black man, Wallace Saunders, who worked in the roundhouse shops at Canton, Mississippi, who wrote the first Casey Jones ballad. Though it's a little more complicated than this, and there's a whole book I'm going to write to explain why it's a little more complicated than that, but he's who we often kind of give credit for this here. It was an ode to a fallen engineer and a fallen colleague, essentially, is what we think this sort of came from here. A lot of these songs really focus on the heroism of the engineers. Casey Jones is, as the song reminds us, the story of a brave engineer. And this frame of the brave engineer was something we see in newspaper reporting as well. In my first book, I spent a lot of time looking at newspaper coverage of train wrecks, and I wrote about train wrecking, how many companies would kind of blame train wreckers, these anonymous villains, for train wrecks. I remember sitting on a back porch in the oppressive Gainesville heat, making a spreadsheet of all the train wrecks I could find in newspapers. It was very morbid stuff, but grad school, sometimes a dark time for us all. Is all for one of Bill's Southern History research seminars, that research there. But anyway, that was one way they distracted from this sort of train wreck issue, to blame it on other folks. Highlighting the brave engineer also kind of does this too. We see this in the initial articles about Casey Jones. They highlight his heroism. He went down with the train. We have reports from the wreck itself, people talking about how brave he was, how miraculous it was that no one died in this thing, basically. And I think focusing on individual kind of lets the corporation off the hook. There's systemic causes of these wrecks. There's a reason why there's so many of these disasters happening, but we just focus on one individual, and that sort of distracts us from these bigger problems that are out there. It sort of assures the anxious public that there's heroes, running the railroads and keeping us safe. So it's a way to kind of distract from some of this carnage with some of these ideas in these songs too. There's a read of these songs that is pretty conservative. We can think about how they do reinforce Southern race and gender roles. There's almost always a black fireman adjacent to the doomed engineer. He usually jumps or escapes from the disaster, the black fireman. A lot of these ballads you can read in the voice, even of the black fireman, reporting on what has happened here. This, of course, reflects the reality of the racially stratified workplaces of the Jim Crow South. Casey's African-American fireman, Sim Webb, would not have been able to rise any higher in the corporation. Many white Southerners really liked having black firemen. There's a almost sort of master-slave relationship that develops within the rail cab, historians have argued. We have a wife or mother in these songs often, but they almost always attach to domestic settings. They're mourning the railroad man from home, talking about the children. It reinforces this idea of the engineer as the breadwinner and the woman as in the domestic sphere. Record 187 has a very jarring ending, too, for the wife of the doomed engineer. It warns wives to, quote, never speak harsh words to your fair loving husband. He may leave you and never return, which is just an odd way to end a song about a train wreck. But so there's a sort of conservative read here. They focus on the individual, they reify these race and gender hierarchies. That's not too subversive, those reads, but I think there is more going on when we look at how they treat speed, these songs, because we always have this overarching theme of going way too fast in the train wreck ballads. There's always a boast about how fast the train is. We have George Alley's Fast Flying Virginian, the swiftest on the line, as the song goes. The subject of the wreck of C&O number 5 was the pride of the C&O, virtually indestructible, it was said. Billy Richardson's old number 3 was the fastest on the rail. Number 52, the doomed train from another wreck ballad, the fastest on the old Southern line. Old 97 was going 90 miles an hour before it crashed. And we have Harry Covington, another doomed engineer, who says, I mean to run this cannonball the fastest ever sailed, boasting about the speed of his train. And you get the point. There's lots of speed discussion in these. But it's not technological glory or engineering bravado that's causing this speed. There was a Southern tradition of steamboat racing that this kind of compares to, I think. Before the Civil War, we have all these captains racing down Mississippi, trying to break these speed records, and they kept record books even of this. And of course, steamboats blew up too from these races sometimes. But this was something different though. The doomed engineers are not really racing for pride. They're racing against the clock. There's always strict orders in these songs. The story of Casey Jones is all about this sort of race against the clock. He's flying down the track very recklessly, not again for glory, but to get out to Canton on time with the Southern Mail, to follow the mandated timetable. We'll be on time or we're leaving the rails, he tells his firemen ominously. The FFE was running on the C&O road 20 minutes behind, as the song goes. And when they gave Steve Brady, the old 97, his orders, they told him, Steve, you're way behind time. Dolly Womack of the doomed C&O number 5 tells his firemen, we're running way behind. When I pull in the Big Bend Tunnel, I mean to be on time. So the ultimate result of these songs is always a deadly train wreck, and this undercuts these kind of glories of speed and in a subtle way expresses resistance at these corporate mandates. The engineers are doing their duty in these songs, but warnings about speed are always coming from other characters. George Alley's mother warned him, many a poor man's lost his life trying to make up time before he crashes to his doom. The people said to Casey Jones, you're running over time, points at the narrative bluesman Ferd Lewis's 1927 rendition of Casey Jones. George Alley was, quote, murdered upon a railroad and laid in a lonesome grave. And the word murder really sort of implies this deliberate violence on the part of the railroad company and outrage here. We see ominous warnings about speed from the southern landscape, too. It's a mighty rough road from Lynchburg to Danville, reminds the narrator of the old 97, and Allegheny Mountains so high torment another train. So these critiques, I think, reflect the fact the South's in the middle of wrenching speed up. Southern railroads went through a wave of consolidation in the economic turmoil of the 1890s, which left the bulk of the region's rail lines in the hands of a few large conglomerates, like J.P. Morgan's Southern Railway. At the time of Casey's final run, these newly ascendant systems were promoting fast mail limited trains that bypassed smaller depots and that speedily linked distant locales. The Illinois Central had been working to cut the time of the runs in its 4-passenger trains, and year by year the company compressed the schedule, placing higher demands on the skill and the bravery of the engineers who ran these trains. A mere 6 months for the wreck that killed Casey Jones, the company announced radical improvements and additions in its service to the South. And they unveiled the New Orleans Special, a new fast mail trim, which is the one that Casey Jones would crash. Casey's fireman would later tell an interviewer that Casey Jones got promoted to this run after replacing another engineer who experienced too much nervousness in trying to keep pace with this new fast schedule. Southern Railway Train 97, which wrecked in Danville in 1903, had a similar checkered history before the famous ballad even emerged. Newspaper reports of the wreck noted this was the 3rd time the fast mail has been almost entirely demolished. And they blamed high speed, the engineers unfamiliar with the route, and the fact that the train was 1 hour behind its fast schedule. This was the fastest train by far in the South, the papers reported, but it kept on wrecking due to trying to make up this lost time. There have been so many accidents on this route that the insurance fund used to pay out disability and death benefits to postal workers was almost exhausted. It just kept crashing over and over again. So in short, there's a speed up on the Southern rails in the 1890s, and it clearly was taking a toll on the workers charged with delivering these results. Engineers were locked into tight schedules, forced to keep up with these fast timetables, and faced a bewildering array of disciplinary procedures and rules if they failed to do so. So in the broader book, I look at how the engineer had gone from being this position of glory into being this sort of menial drudgery kind of position. There's this decline in engineer status over the course of the 19th century. They're almost interchangeable parts by the time of Casey Jones' final run in 1900 here. So obsession with speed has extra resonance in the South. I mean, the Southern angle is important to understanding this. This captures a pretty key tension in the New South movement and its calls for Southern revival through industrialization and outside investment. For the New South boosters, railroads come to symbolize one of the victories of the movement. They touted these new lines. They were evidence of progress. The fact that we have all these railroads, the fact that they're speeding up, it is a good thing for the boosters, obviously. Boosters also hoped the South would catch up to the North in terms of business and industry and adopt Yankee values, Yankee pace. All these things come to the New South idea of trying to match what the North is doing. But these stories about doomed white men trying and failing to make up lost time and match the schedule suggest this is a flawed process. And of course, historians remind us that the New South, of course, fell pretty far short of its lofty goals. We know the South became locked into a sort of colonial relationship with the North. Of course, the progress of the New South coincided with lots of racial violence, the rise of Jim Crow, and this all came at high cost to Southern workers, whether they be white engineers or black convict laborers who built the railroads, like John Henry. So it's also kind of interesting, too, from a Southern perspective, how these narratives of speed and disaster contrasted with the popular imagery of the region at the time. This old South nostalgia is, of course, booming at the same time as these wrecks. By the 1910s, we have Tin Pan Alley songwriters who are based in New York City cranking out all these songs about going back to Dixie. They're showing us the region as being relaxed and rural and happily ensconced in the plantation past. In these songs, the South was a place behind and outside of time, with nothing to rush about. It was escape from the urbanizing and bustling North. And of course, this is a myth. The Old South, of course, was not this placid, happy land of moonlight magnolias. But this is the image the country is kind of adopting. At the same time, we have Old 97 screeching and scattering down the track, which is sort of calling into question these narratives, just as it's calling into question the idea of the New South itself here. Ironically, we know a lot about these narratives of disaster because the efforts of folklorists. This is turning into a Howard Odom moment, I guess, with this panel. I'll bring up Odom in a second here. But we have all these sort of folklorists, song collectors, who really start to scour the region for songs after the turn of the century. The idea was that the South was this repository of long-lost ballads and lore. We have someone like Cecil Sharp coming from England who's looking for remnants of old English ballads that he thought got stuck in the southern mountains. And he did find some of these old English ballads, but he also found lots of new railroad songs. One of my favorite stories about Sharp, he finds this song, Swannoa Tunnel, thinks, oh yeah, this is obviously about this town in England, Swannoa Town, but it was about putting a railroad the next county over. It was totally misconceptions of where this thing's actually coming from. It's about a railroad disaster outside Asheville, this song, basically. So we know a lot about, the disasters of the railroad because of these collectors. Swannoa Tunnel is sort of a famous one. And of course, the John Henry stories also came to us from many of these song collectors, too. These are, kind of narratives of resistance coming from the work camps, telling us about this guy who was, as historian Scott Nelson tells us, was killed by silicosis, basically. It's a pretty bleak story. Other collectors like Howard Odom and E.C. Perrow were working in Mississippi and Alabama, and their collections confirm widespread oral circulation of subversive narratives, like these verses about speed that were critical to the railroad companies and the idea of the New South. They found songs about Railroad Bill and Jesse James, train robbers who were reimagined as Robin Hood figures in these songs. They found songs about John Henry, songs critiquing Jay Gould and Vanderbilt, and of course plenty of songs about train wrecks and engineers were bouncing around the South. E.C. Perrow noted that during the winter of 1908-1909, he found Mississippi full of versions of a song, very popular then, called Casey Jones. Odom found that African Americans were singing different versions of Casey Jones, the ones that were popularly going around through the vaudeville circuits. So this surge in interest in Southern song collecting just so happened to be perfectly timed to capture these railroad disasters of the 1880s and 90s. And this helps enshrine lots of these songs into our American folk song canon, this collecting wave. But the 1920s, a new boom of interest in these songs firmly fixed them in southern locales when we have this hillbilly recording boom of the 1920s. Sensing an untapped market and facing competition from radio, Record companies sent out talent scouts in the 1920s and sought out hillbilly and folk performers from the South for recording sessions. The hillbilly genre was sort of kicked off, a lot of folks argue, with Fiddlin' John Carson's 1923 song, Little Old Cabin by the Lame. And then Carson did a second follow-up recording session and recorded his own version of Casey Jones. 4 months later, a group called the Skillet Lickers, also from North Georgia, recorded their own Casey Jones in New York. This would be the first record of a Southern rural artist for the Columbia label. The song that truly launched the genre as a commercial success was Vernon Dalhart's 1924 recording, a record of the old 97, the smash hit of the decade. To go on to sell more than 7 million copies, becoming nationally famous, basically. At least one scholar has argued that it was songs like these train wreck ballads that sparked the success of hillbilly records and country music at large. After the success of Record of the Old 97, record companies commissioned more and more of these event songs, as they were called. They dealt with topics as diverse as a death of a man in a cave, Floyd Collins, the California earthquake, the Scopes trial, the death of William Jennings Bryan shows up in the song, the crash of an airship, an execution of a criminal in Atlanta. But the train wreck is sort of the most ubiquitous theme in these 1920s recordings. The hillbilly artists were recording new versions of older ballads, reviving songs like Casey Jones, and new compositions as well. They had new songs they wrote, making up train wrecks, even fictional train wrecks making into some of these songs as well. The most popular of these artists was arguably Jimmie Rodgers, who even dressed like a railroad man, an engineer. He recorded Ben DuBarry's Final Run, which was written by a songwriter for him, but it very much is the exact same trope as these train wreck ballads. It's going too fast. It's almost the Casey Jones song ripped off and given a new name. So for a brief moment, the railroad man, as embodied by Rodgers, the so-called singing brakeman, was the prototypical country star. Rodgers really did come from a railroading background, of course. He had been trying to make a musician for a long time, though, so is it as authentic as he presents himself? Maybe, maybe not. But the railroading getup did help to give him this kind of authentic air. As one country music scholar argues, this lets him appear to be a fast-traveling man, a rambler, and a bit of a rake, but also a working man who can send money home to his family. It lets him combine these kind of ideas, the railroad getup. So this hillbilly wave of train wreck ballads really firmly fixes disasters as Southern. Casey Jones actually does kind of drift a bit as a song after its Southern origins. In 1909, the song was reworked as a vaudeville hit, becomes the most popular song in the nation for much of the 1910s. But this version was set in a pretty vague Western locale. He crashes after going up Reno Hill. He was trying to bring the Western mail to Frisco in this popular version. But the hillbilly songs bring him back south again. Many of the song lyrics contain lyrics from folk versions that predated the vaudeville version. The Skillet Lickers' 1927 recording begins with a train horn, an announcement we're going south to Birmingham, so it's literally bringing him back to the South, and Southern accents as well in these recordings. So Casey Jones appears again and again in the 1920s in these recordings from artists like George Renaud, the blind musician of the Smoky Mountains, Prince Albert Hunt's Texas Ramblers, Wilmer Watts's Lonely Eagles, these are fun names to read, that's why I'm reading them, the Dixie Demons, Bob Skiles' Four Old Tuners, Arizona Wranglers, and Vernon Dalhart, who recorded 5 different versions of Casey Jones during this boom. So what explains the appeal of the train wreck ballad to 1920s audiences? For one, it seems the artists were giving listeners what they wanted and what they're familiar with. A lot of these artists were recording songs they knew and were used to performing, which demonstrates that many of these songs have been in widespread circulation in the dance halls, street corners, fiddling contests, and nightclubs that constitute the musical worlds of the early 20th century South. These records are mostly marketed to Southern audiences, too, to working class whites who were flocking to the industrializing Piedmont and toiling in textile mills. While many of these so-called lint heads held nostalgia for their rural homes, and this is the theme of some of these songs, the music about train wrecks probably actually felt kind of relevant to their situations. A lot of these textile workers had felt a transition from rural ways of timekeeping to the standardized, faster pace of the textile mill. They've gone from the quietude of the countryside to the hustle and bustle of places like Atlanta and Charlotte. They've gone from a task-based system of labor and farming, performing jobs as needed throughout the day and with the rhythms of nature, to the hourly wage and the rules in the factory. Just as the timetable and watch dictated Casey Jones's Final Run, the clock and the bell ordered and structured the labor inside the textile mills. By the 1920s, textile mills were going at the same time as stretch out and speed up the railroads had encountered in the 1890s. Just like it happened with Southern railroads, the industry was consolidating in the hands of outside capital, placing new demands on workers. These tensions, of course, then exploded to a big wave of strikes in the late 1920s. I was driving through all these sort of towns like Marion and Gastonia on the way to the airport actually yesterday, of thinking about all these various textile towns outside Charlotte. So these strikes then breathed new life into these songs, and of course spoke to their popularity too. We have union organizers and workers who are singing these songs, refashioning train wreck ballads to invigorate their struggles. Gastonia, of course, has the most maybe iconic of these strikes, where we have the communist-led unions coming down to lead these strikes in 1929. And there's this sort of kind of funny story. Northern organizers came down and tried to teach them the Northern labor standards. It's let's sing Solidarity Forever, but that's set to the tune of John Brown's Body. That's not going to really play too well in the South. So they're trying to teach them these, songs in their IWW books that aren't really hitting too well. But the strikers start to kind of come up with their own songs. Ella Mae Wiggins is sort of the most famous of these striker songstresses, and she reworks songs like Casey Jones to speak to the textile workers' struggles. The song "Come All You Scabs," she writes, is set to the tune of Casey Jones. She sets "The Speakers Didn't Mind" to the tune of Record 97. So we have this evidence that these textile workers are kind of taking these songs, refashioning them. Chicago newspaper even reported that the song set to the tune of Casey Jones was sung at her funeral as she was, of course, shot by company thugs, essentially. And the reporter was kind of puzzled, why is a railroad song being sung at this somber occasion? So they may have changed the word to these songs, reimagined Casey Jones. When the struggle against the clock, these textile workers had far more in common with the union engineers than it may have seemed. So this hillbilly boom sort of dies out with the onset of the Depression. It kind of fades away. Country music moves on to new fixations. The railroad guy kind of dies out. They start dressing as cowboys eventually by the 30s and 40s and beyond. But the train wreck does linger as a theme in the genre and in American music at large. The songs, the characters in them have pretty long lives. We have songs like R.E.M's Driver 8, which talks about the idea of times all embedded in that song. Of course, the Grateful Dead reimagined Casey Jones. We have Johnny Cash, Chris Christopherson writing about Casey Jones songs eventually. And more recently, we've seen Casey Jones, a central character in Gillian Welch's critically acclaimed album, Time the Revelator. So to wrap things up, I've presented this work in lots of other venues, and I've gotten the question sometimes, why is this a Southern story? What makes Casey Jones Southern? Couldn't this have happened in Iowa or Indiana? Wrecks did happen in those places, obviously, but I think the Southernness of Casey Jones and these doomed engineers explains a lot about sort of why these stories linger with us. They tell us something about the South, of course, and how it encounters industrialization. These critiques of speed have extra power, I think, in the South as well. They're documents of a society going through a rapid speed up, and they give us a pretty incisive critique of the New South that resonates to this day. Thanks. I think we can take questions for either of us. I'll have a seat here, and either of us can take questions about ourselves.
Develop that last point you were making about why there are more of these songs elsewhere compared to in the South. Was it that the nature of the wrecks or the labor conflicts was different, or is it the prevalence of folk songwriters?
It's just a combination of all these things, I think. The South does have more dangerous railroads, part of it, I think. Perhaps more worker anger as well, I think. There's more of a sense the workers are being maybe screwed by these companies, I think, which also adds it. A lot of the factors sort of combine, I think, for that. But something I wrestle with a lot, why isn't Casey Jones in Iowa or Oregon? But I think the fact that it's a Southern story gives it this extra power, I think.
What about California and the building of the Continental Railroad and Chinese labor? Are there songs about all that?
Yeah, there are. They just don't really make it into our consciousness. There's a bunch of Mormon songs, actually, about the railroad, which is kind of interesting. They just don't really get into country music like these songs do. And I think I was trying to trace why that's so. And it's, the fact that these songs come out of this dangerous environment, but also the fact that we have, of course, the collectors coming down, these ideas about the South as being the repository of lore. People aren't looking for maybe these songs in Iowa either, I don't think. I mean, the folklorists aren't really scouring Iowa for songs. They're going to the South. The South's what seems to be behind time. The South's what seems to be the sort of magical realm where we find these ballads. So all these things, I think, kind of combine to give us the sort of idea of the Trainwreck ballad as a Southern kind of story.
Yeah.
I actually have a question for Holloway. So, in the 1970s, psychohistory was pretty in vogue. It was famous with John Brown. Was Virginia Penny ever a subject of a psychohistory then, or maybe discussed in psychohistory then, to your knowledge?
I don't think so. I haven't really found very much written about her outside of the context of her work on women's labor. There was actually a historian, an economic historian at Syracuse named Gensimer, I forget her first name, who was ostensibly writing a biography of Virginia Penny, and she unfortunately passed of a fairly serious illness while she was still quite young and writing. And I'm mentioning this in part on the off chance that any of you know her, because I'm trying to figure out, does she have a partially written manuscript on Virginia Penny somewhere, or papers that I haven't been able to find? Susan Gensimer. So, but no, I don't think anyone's written about her at all outside of the context of her book on labor.
Say something about how you found or discovered Penny.
Oh, yeah.
Sort of track the ways in which you conducted what seems to be pretty interesting research.
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing this larger project on the ability to testify in court, and I ran across, in the context of trying to find some sources on limitations on people with mental incompetency, court testimony limitations based on mental incompetency. I found her testimony at the hearings that were held on conditions at the asylum. And then I'm like, well, who's this person? And I'm not even sure. I think I just sort of randomly Googled Virginia Penny just to see who the heck this was, and realized that it was the same Virginia Penny that had written these books in women's labor history. And then since I do legal research, I was pretty adept at being able to go to the Kentucky archives and pretty quickly sort through all of the case files that were relevant to her brother's institutionalization. And then, like, kind of the last one was the one that had this completely unexpected trove of her letters. And it's really like her notes that she was taking as she was writing to law. There's letters to the attorneys, there's letters to the court. There's even like, she's practicing legal terms, so she's looked up legal terms in law dictionaries, and she writes out the definition of them, and then you can see that legal term show up in her subsequent letters. So she's sort of teaching herself the law as it went along. It was really neat to see.
Yeah, so I mean, on the one hand, given that she, attempted to murder this one guy, she seemed to have gotten off okay, and like after she gets out of the asylum, they put her in jail for attempted murder.
Yeah, she's not. Yeah, so she's just institutionalized. She's not jailed. Yeah.
And then she's let go.
Yeah.
So, notwithstanding what seems like a pretty serious infraction, the letter from the testimony from the doctor sounds like sort of classic, like hysteria is what I thought.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
as a medical history, I mean, it's a super fascinating way of marginalizing this woman who's just, as he says, just challenging powerful men. Mm-hmm. I mean, so, and I guess I'm wondering about the diagnoses, which I don't know, the kind of medical history of insanity and hysteria, and whether that's specifically gendered, or whether, because it seems like this is a way to talk about that.
Yeah, for sure.
It's totally just causing trouble, but in a way, as you said, like a lot of her complaints seem entirely justified.
Yeah, and even men were violent and not considered insane necessarily, right? I mean, there's definitely a great literature on women's, the marginalization of aberrant women and women who strayed from gender as well as class and occasionally racial norms, and their diagnosis of insanity to silence them by husbands, by other powerful men. I mean, there's definitely a literature on that, and I think she fits quite well into that literature. But what's interesting for me, actually, I didn't have time to obviously put all my arguments into my talk, is that she's able to pivot this into a kind of empowerment, because once she's freed from the asylum, now she's an expert on asylums. And she's a witness to the conditions in the asylum, and she now speaks as an expert and gets quite a platform as someone who's witnessed this firsthand, but is also, you know, competent enough and obviously extraordinarily articulate enough to describe what had happened and then leverage it into political activism. So in a way, the attempt to silence her empowered her in a way, or she's able to leverage it into a kind of empowerment, which I think is pretty neat.
I have a question for Scott. Actually, several questions, but time being what it is.
Talk fast, speed it up.
So one of the things that obviously your talk makes me think about, or one of the people your talk makes me think about, is Jimmy Rogers and his persona as this sort of railroad man. I'm wondering if you can kind of place him in your work, or if that's at all something that connects to him.
Yeah, no, I think he's really fascinating. I can tell I'm kind of wrestling with these ideas still as I wrote the paper, but with this really obsession with the train wreck ballad and with Jimmy Rogers, all these things in the 1920s, it's the big obsession, which from a memory perspective, I think is looking back sort of, I think, at the 1890s. And, you know, perhaps it's also a function too, the railroad is sort of starting to fade a bit by then. They'd been, you know, nationalized during World War I. There's also a big railroad strike in 1922, the shopmen's strike, which I think might have some relevance as well. So I'm trying to kind of tie this together, but I think he is kind of giving us the engineer. I mean, that's what he looks like, basically. And the engineer was sort of a respected position at one point in the 19th century. These are guys who were a friendly face to communities. They drove the trains fast. They had this bravado. So I think he's maybe an echo of that idea. It's a brief echo because he's sort of there and he dies pretty quickly and goes on something else. But I'm trying to understand him some more because he's a really fascinating kind of figure for my work and, of course, history of country music as a whole.
You might also think of D4 Bailey, right, and his harmonica and the way he plays that.
Yeah, there's just a lot of, I've been going through lots of music listing, which has been fun, but trying to figure out the 1920s and, but just this obsession with the train wreck ballad is sort of why 1920s. I'm still trying to figure this out, and textile workers, I think, give us some explanation. There's more I'm working with for sure, but.
Well, first of all, as I was listening to the second talk, I was thinking that Virginia Penny seems like somebody that someone should have written
A train wreck ballad, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly.
A train wreck, you know, symbolically, at least, like it's. But it also made me wonder, because the only thing I ever learned about Virginia Penny was her as an author of books about and studies about working women and a kind of social science, you know, early female social scientist, although not in a formal way, but that she did this work. And it made me wonder whether her history of, you know, crime and chaos and attempted murder, was there any, did people realize this was the same person who'd done this kind of social scientific work that was published? Did it have an effect on how that book, because when I was in grad school, this was one, I mean, you know, the field of women's history was relatively young and there weren't that many things to read, and this was one of the things on working women that was on the list. And I had no idea that she was this, you know, incredible character that might make you think twice about her social scientific work.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things to think about with your question, but I mean, some of the reports do say she's an authoress. When she goes in with a gun, the Civil War informant says she was an authoress. I don't know if I don't think the Louisville School Board parents did. But I don't think anyone's ever connected the dots, like, since, like, the 1890s. Like, I guess when she's in New York and in poverty and not doing well and writing these crazy letters to the newspaper, people knew that was that Virginia Penny. I mean, to be honest, when I first saw her in the Louisville, I was like, is this the same Virginia Penny? Like, sorry, thank you. Like, I sort of like wasn't sure. Like, could this be the same one? And then I started looking at their lineage. I'm like, yeah, it's the same Virginia Penny. So no, I don't think anyone's connected this. Like the people that know her, as you know her, I certainly don't think anyone knows this later story. For better or for worse. And I don't know, does it discredit her earlier work? Does it make you question it? I think it makes it more interesting. Yeah.
We have this sense of, particularly of social science, I mean the precursors to social science history, you know, we think of them as not necessarily objective, but as, you know, they're quantifiers, they're people who look at data and organize, you know, they're very organized, they're thinking in patterns, and then in this case, it's like she goes off the rails.
She sees a lot of patterns.
I mean, it's a very short time as a, you know, kind of social science-minded gatherer of data, and then she takes this turn that's...
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is the movement. If I had to think about it that way, I think maybe to some extent the women's movement kind of moves on from her. Mm-hmm. And I think she feels kind of rejected, like her scholarship was never truly appreciated. Women started doing all these jobs, and she was sort of offended they didn't thank her for her efforts to get them these jobs. So I think that she sort of splits in that sense. But you're right, it's a...
If she'd only known she was going to be on a University of Pennsylvania reading list decades later.
Yeah. Stephen.
With the juxtaposition of your PowerPoint and your fascinating discussion, someone I never heard of, but were you suggesting in that juxtaposition that Link is insane for writing that?
The dogged determination, the tireless efforts, the eyes peering out from under a bonnet. Wait a minute, I don't remember the bonnet.
When I'm thinking about her, and I'm thinking about the context, and part of the context, you know, Aaron said earlier about gendered way of looking at insanity, but if she were around today with social media of one sort or another, would she not be revered by a large segment of the population?
Or possibly elected to the House of Representatives from Georgia?
She'd be representing North Georgia.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating when you think about it, just the context.
She was very media savvy in a way, you know, yeah. She's good at getting herself in the spotlight. I can't figure out if she's right or left, though. I'm not sure whose side she would have been on.
Why did women suffragists try to help her after she denounced them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think she was a complete jerk to them. And yet.
Scott, I'm from Davidson County, North Carolina. The train wreck that had Eddie Oakley and Buffalo Bill, is there a string of literature songs that I don't know about?
I don't know about that one, to be honest. That's a train wreck I don't know much about.
We'll talk later.
Yeah, well, for sure, yeah. That intrigues me for sure, though, yeah. Yeah.
I was just going to say that, Erin, I'm kind of amazed that she got off so light for going in and holding a gun to the head of these people and threatening to kill them. That seemed, even in our day, you'd get in trouble for that. Nobody would arrest you for carrying a gun, maybe, but her, you know, she going up and threatening to kill somebody, and you know, so she does get put into the asylum for that, but then after a while, she's released with no further consequences. It starts making me think about, given the fact that many women in the 19th century, as we mentioned before, were institutionalized for a lot less than that, it begs the question of why wasn't she institutionalized and kept in?
Do you mean in an insane asylum or in a prison?
In the insane asylum. You know, a lot of women were institutionalized for, and I'm suggesting a possible answer, and that is a lot of the women that were put away, it was to get them to silence them or to get them out of somebody's way, just like, you the early studies of Carol Carlson's work about witchcraft and the powerful witch. You remember that amazing piece? And her answer was, why were some women who were arrested and accused executed and others let go? And the answer tended to be direct correspondence between how much wealth were these women sitting on that men wanted to get their hands on.
Right.
So in other words, if you didn't have anybody to protect you who was powerful, and if you were well off, you tended to have more of a chance of being dealt with than if you were somebody who didn't have anything that somebody else wanted. And in her case, okay, so who's she bothering? Apparently she wasn't bothering anybody enough that they wanted to permanently put her away, or she didn't have, or in your case it sounds like being put away would cost somebody something, and nobody was willing to spend the money to keep her in an institution.
Well, I may have a charming faith in judicial processes, but there was a process in Kentucky by which a court made this determination, and it was a jury trial in a sense. It was a jury hearing. And so, I mean, initially the jury found her insane, but when she was able to get a rehearing, the jury found her to not be insane. I mean, they rejected the advice of the asylum superintendent. And there's a story there, which is also in the literature on insanity and disability, about this moment in history in which sort of lay people are challenging the medical authority of the authority of the medical establishment to determine insanity, and courts are sort of pushing back against doctors. Who decides if someone's insane? Is it a medical thing? Is it a community diagnosis? Is it a judge? And she falls on the right side of that. I mean, they can't hold her if a jury finds her not to be insane.
But hold on, in today's world, if you commit a crime and your defense is insanity, and then they rule that you're insane, then they go ahead and prosecute you.
Yeah, I think we're talking about a difference between a court hearing for the crime, like a criminal trial. This was not a criminal trial, it was a civil hearing. So you're right, she escaped a criminal punishment for this. Although you have to remember too that elite white women you had to really murder someone to actually, I mean, if you were an elite white woman, you weren't gonna be incarcerated except for the most serious of crimes, and no one was really hurt. So, I mean, that'd be my assumption. They can't, they would have to jail her in the circumstances that most elite white women were never put in.
Follow up on that question for Pippa. It's funny that you mentioned Kentucky, because in between this morning session and this afternoon session, I was sorting through some research that I did at Kentucky, also in the wrong box, but I found it. And so I'm working on this project about the history of stigma and deviance in American history. And particularly if the concept of a folk devil can be useful in understanding how moral problems come to achieve a level of stigma. And in this case, a folk devil will take an outlier of some kind and elevate it to be like a common threat and threaten imminently. And I'm wondering, in her case, if she was an outlier, but it doesn't seem like she was made to be a general social threat, or that her what they might call hysteria or neurasthenia or whatever was made to be a threat to school children, to the general public, to something that people need to be concerned about. And I'm wondering if the asylum kind of came to play that role in her case, that instead of being a threat, we could sort of remove her from society. So, I don't know, did people view her at the time and her eccentricity as a threat, like a social threat?
It's of course hard to know how people viewed anyone. All I've got are the newspaper, I've only got a limited view of the people, of course, as we all do, unfortunately. But, I mean, much of the coverage of her tends to be sort of demeaning. They often, she's an old maid, she's a an elderly, she's not actually that old. She was like my age when they described her as a little old lady in a bonnet. I'm like, wait a minute here. So I think that like there's ways they sort of marginalize her and make her seem like not a threat, and that might have actually made her even angrier. I think like, okay, now she's like, I'm gonna get a gun. I'll show you I'm a threat. I'm not some sweet little old crazy lady. That's kind of my sense, is that it's not operating how you would suggest. Sort of much to her chagrin. I think she wanted to be more of a threat than she was.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna adjourn, take about a 15-minute break,